Well, thank you, Speaker, for that opportunity. Of course,
I can hear the buses roaring and
bring the temperature down just slightly to join in today's energized discussion calling for a public inquiry on the awarding and management of public contracts in the energy industry, a call that follows the recent launch of the 5th OPP anti-rackets squad investigation into this government's dealings. That's right, Speaker. And I know we've heard it over and over again this afternoon, but no matter how many times you say it, the fact that this government has somehow managed...
I would ask that now the member from Hamilton Mountain, I know you have a conversation going on with perhaps the member from Barrie. I would ask that you keep it down so that I can hear the member from Kitchener-Conestoga debate your motion. So I would again encourage the member now to continue, and I would encourage participation and cooperation amongst the legislators. Thank you.
The fact that this government has somehow managed to muddy itself with a record 5 OPP investigation bears repeating. And of course, while the recent developments that have led to an OPP probe into the Wind Liberals' handing of Trillium Power Energy Corporation provides the basis for the latest investigation, they follow a long, winding road of scandal and unaccountability that runs completely counter to the principles of openness and transparency, those same items that this Liberal government was in fact elected on. So, Speaker, I would like to take us back, of course, in time, remind folks where it all began, because as we are speaking to the call for a public inquiry today, there is no doubt that the lack of accountability and transparency we are addressing has roots dating back many years. Back, in fact, to the granddaddy of the Liberal OPP scandal trail, so to speak, better known as the Ontario Liberal gas plant cancellations. Who knew back in 2010 the seeds for the scandal-ridden ride this government is taking on were in fact being planted? In fact, it was October 7th, 2010 that those first seeds took root as the Liberals positioned themselves ahead of a 2011 election in announcing the cancellation of the proposed Oakville gas-fired power plant. 11 months later, in the middle of the Ontario election campaign, the other shoe dropped as our current finance minister announced plans to scrap a partially built gas plant in Mississauga, a move that would inevitably save his seat. Once election victory was secured, and I remember hearing how President Obama spent $1 billion to get elected. $1 billion, of money in the U.S. privately raised to get elected, the leader of the free world. We spent $1 billion to get Charles Sousa elected. Anyways,
not a good bargain.
So, once that election victory was secured, the unraveling of months and years of work to prevent damning emails charting the course of the scandal led to criminal charges for 2 former senior Liberal staff and a prorogation by a former premier as he headed for the exits. Further, years of opposition work in committee eventually revealed the fact that, in the end, taxpayers spent $1.1 billion to cancel the gas plants that would save Liberal seats simply to keep them in power. The price of power, Speaker? $1.1 billion and counting. Imagine the health care, the education, or the IBI therapy $1.1 billion could buy. And so it was in 2013 that we were told to expect a new era from the new Premier who promised accountability, who promised transparency, and told us social justice is what drives me. It's why I'm here. Close to 3 years later, we're left to wonder what happened to that Premier. Where did she go?
What happened?
In fact, soon after she took power, we were sent back down that same hole into the repeated cycle that has seen the Wynne Liberal government use taxpayers' money to fit their political ends, rejecting those principles of accountability and transparency they had so recently spoken to, and then spinning like a top until the police step in. 5 times now, Speaker, 5 OPP investigations, and yet still we see the same old song and dance from this government, who, instead of living up to the Premier's commitment to transparency, took steps to ensure the fulfillment of her own other statement that my plan is to govern as long as I can. Indeed, we see it today as Liberals jump up to reject calls for a public inquiry into their lake-bound wind energy decision-making, just as we saw it only a few weeks ago with the rejection of our calls to an inquiry into political financing reform. Here's a party that was voted in on openness and transparency, working to ensure their cabinet ministers have specific monetary targets to raise in donations for the benefit of the Ontario Liberal Party and the Ontario Liberal Fund. So, while the Premier and her Energy Minister are meeting with energy sector companies for one-on-one access at a cost of $6,000 per ticket, on one hand, they're turning around and making energy policy decisions, meeting their own ends on the other. And so we have one of the banks that ran the lucrative privatization of Hydro One, a privatization that most Ontarians is staunchly set against, promoting a $7,500 per person fundraiser for the 2 Ontario provincial cabinet ministers that are in fact in charge of the sale. Speaker, the fire sale of Hydro One has seen opposition from 185 municipalities and nearly 80% of Ontarians, and yet they move ahead in a way, while feeding the Liberal coffers at every step. The event on December 7th, which featured Finance Minister Charles Sousa and Energy Minister Bob Shirley, may have raised about $165,000 for the Liberals. But the fact is that we will continue to pay for the Hydro One fire sale as the province loses out approximately $700 million in revenue every year. $700 million a year, Speaker.
Long-term.
Again, we have families of children with autism on our doorstep. We have those with rare disease calling out for government's help. We have people in need in so many sectors, and yet we continue to see the Wynne Liberal government looking at their own needs first. And it's for these reasons that you continue to hear calls for public inquiries, because quite frankly, OPP investigations and public inquiries are about the only things that seem to get this government's attention. Here again, we saw many of the same Liberal players alleged to be involved in program cancellations to meet their own partisan needs, cancelling provincial agreements to Trillium's offshore wind development in a Liberal riding to boost party support, leaving the taxpayers to pick up the bill. And once again, we see discoveries of emails that may have been wiped out during the infamous gas plant deletion, and once again, we see allegations of deliberate destruction of evidence that cover tracks. Did you notice a theme here, Speaker?
Yeah.
Now, we all continue to wonder how a Premier and a government who said they would be so different has turned out to be so much the same old, choosing their party over the people of Ontario, political gain over needed programs and program enhancements. Again and again, we see the Wynne Liberals looking out not only for the best interests of Ontario, but looking out for their own political survival, and while leaving Ontario taxpayers to foot the bill. As they say, Speaker, the truth will set you free. And for the sake of restoring the public's trust, of living up to the repeated commitments to openness and transparency, the Premier should do the right thing. Call an inquiry and let the system work to ensure the truth really gets out there.
Inquiry.